In today's stories, we will follow four women on K2 who all walked into a death trap. These weren't beginners, they had the experience and the credentials to match. But somewhere above 27,000 feet, on a slope with nothing around them but open air and ice, each one of them ran into something they couldn't climb out of. It was July 19th, 2017, on K2, the second highest mountain in the world, located on the border between Pakistan and China. The mountain rises to 28,251 feet from the Karakoram Range, a mass of dark granite and glacial ice shaped by exposed ridgelines, steep couloirs, and open slopes that offer nothing in the way of shelter when the weather turns. Meg Harlow was 29, an outdoor education instructor from Boulder, Colorado, with 5 years of high mountain experience. She had summited Aconcagua in 2014 and Denali in 2016 via the West Buttress route. K2 was her first 8,000-meter objective. Team members described her preparation habits as unusually methodical. She tracked caloric intake, fluid consumption, and blood oxygen readings at each camp, and had researched the Abruzzi Spur's technical sections in depth before arriving in Pakistan. Astrid Petra was 36, a civil engineer from the Netherlands with 7 years of high-altitude experience and 3 summits above 26,000 feet, including Cho Oyu and Lhotse. K2 was her fourth 8,000-meter objective, and she was considered the most experienced client in the group. Her acclimatization rotations had been the most consistent of the 4 women. No physiological concerns had been flagged at any point, and at base camp, she was the one other team members came to with technical questions about gear rigging and anchor systems. Claire Neve was 32, a professional mountain guide from Lyon, France, with previous summits of Denali and Broad Peak. She had attempted K2 once before in 2014. Reaching Camp 3 before deteriorating, weather forced the team off. This was her second attempt. The lead guide had noted she was one of the technically strongest members of the group. She moved on fixed lines with the precision of someone who had spent years guiding clients through exposed terrain, with the kind of controlled economy of movement that most climbers at altitude spend years trying to develop. Laura Sundström was 32, a structural engineer from Stockholm, Sweden, with 8 years of alpine climbing experience across Scandinavia and the Greater Himalayas. She had summited Broad Peak in 2015 and Gasherbrum 2 in 2016. K2 was her third 8,000-meter objective. She was the quietest of the 4 women in camp, but her performance on the rotation cycles had been consistently strong. She had shown no signs of altitude-related difficulty at any stage of the preparation. During the second rotation cycle, she had been the fastest through the fixed rope section between Camp 2 and Camp 3, a technical stretch that climbers typically find increasingly difficult with each successive ascent. On the mountain, she conserved energy efficiently and moved without excess effort. The 4 women were assigned to the second rope group for the summit push, alongside 1 high-altitude support climber. The first rope group consisted of the expedition's 3 remaining members, including the lead guide. The plan called for both groups to depart Camp 4 simultaneously at midnight, maintain radio contact throughout, and begin descent no later than 2 p.m. to ensure the upper technical sections were cleared before any afternoon weather could develop. Each climber carried 2 oxygen cylinders, each rated for approximately 6 to 7 hours of flow at 2 liters per minute. All 5 members of the second group completed gear and regulator checks the evening before departure. Everything tested functional. The regulator fittings were inspected. The cylinder valves were confirmed operational. Mask seals were checked against each climber's face. The support climber ran through the checklist twice, once in the early evening and once again at 11:30 p.m. before the team began putting on their outer layers. The morning forecast described moderate cloud cover building at altitude and a possible low-pressure system approaching from the southwest, with arrival estimated at late afternoon to early evening at the earliest. The expedition leader reviewed it with both rope groups. The 2 p.m. turnaround built a buffer against that estimate, and the window was cleared as viable. Camp 4 sat at approximately 26,000 feet on the Abruzzi Spur. At midnight, the temperature was around minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit and wind was low, under 10 miles per hour. The moon offered almost no usable light, and the route ahead was navigated entirely by headlamp. Both groups departed at midnight, with the first rope group establishing a pace roughly 15 minutes ahead of the second. Progress through the lower shoulder was steady. By 3 a.m., the second group had cleared the steep section above camp and was moving across the broad broad, open snowfield of the upper shoulder. No rock features, no windbreak in any direction. By 5:30 a.m., they had reached approximately 27,200 feet, with the first rope group visible roughly 300 feet above. Wind had increased slightly but remained within acceptable range. By 5:30 a.m., the climb had given them nothing to worry about. The pace was good, the fixed lines were solid, and the summit felt within reach. Nobody in the group had shown any sign of difficulty. The conditions were cold but manageable, the wind was within range, and the route ahead was clear. There was no hesitation, no instinct pulling any of them back. It felt, by every measure available to them at that moment, like a normal morning on a mountain they had spent weeks preparing for. By the time the relay came through, they were already inside it. At 6:45 a.m., Base Camp relayed an updated forecast to both rope groups by radio. The low-pressure system initially estimated to arrive late in the afternoon had been remodeled. It was now tracking faster than projected. Arrival was revised to within 3 to 4 hours of the transmission, meaning the system could reach the upper mountain by mid-morning. The first rope group received the relay from their position above 27,600 feet and immediately began descent. The second group received the same relay at approximately 27,400 feet. The support climber acknowledged the transmission and signaled the group to turn around. Wind had already built to approximately 30 miles per hour by the time the descent began. The cloud layer had thickened and dropped noticeably in the hour since first light. Visibility was narrowing. The fixed lines were intact. The team's position gave them a 3 to 4 hour descent to Camp 4 under normal conditions. The updated weather timeline gave them the same window before significant deterioration. The margin had essentially disappeared, but the route was defined and the lines were in place. All 5 climbers clipped onto the fixed lines and began moving downward. The storm arrived well ahead of its revised forecast. By 8 a.m., the wind had built into something that bore no resemblance to conditions 30 minutes earlier. Speeds later estimated at over 60 miles per hour. Based on survivor accounts, cross-referenced against post-incident weather data, the cloud layer had descended fully, eliminating all forward visibility. Temperature had dropped to an estimated minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill well below minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The fixed ropes were still attached, but moving along them had become a continuous effort against every sustained gust, each step requiring a calculated pause between them. There was no pattern to read. The mountain was generating conditions that simply had to be endured. The second group's position when the full storm arrived was approximately 27,300 feet, on the open shoulder, well over an hour above Camp 4, even under ideal conditions. No rock feature, no fold in the terrain, nothing offering any reduction in exposure. At that elevation in that wind, the cold does not seep in gradually. It pulls heat from every exposed surface simultaneously, and insulation systems designed for static conditions lose efficiency rapidly when the body is being asked to produce sustained physical output at the same time. At the time the storm fully arrived, Claire and Lore were approximately 100 to 150 feet below Meg and Astrid on the fixed lines. Claire was moving with controlled precision. Lore was managing her footing methodically. Meg and Astrid were slower, stopping more frequently. The gaps between the two pairs were widening as the storm intensified. Meg was the first to show visible signs of deterioration. She was still on the fixed line, still clipping and unclipping correctly, still making downward progress. But her pace between anchor points had slowed beyond what the wind alone could explain. She was stopping midsection, not at anchors, and then not resuming motion when gusts reduced. The pauses stretched to 15 seconds after each gust before she took another step. At that altitude and in those temperatures, unnecessary stationary time accelerates heat loss in a way that compounds quickly. At approximately 8:20 a.m., a sustained gust struck while Meg was crossing an exposed traverse section just above the shoulder plateau. It hit broadside, disrupting her balance laterally. She slid approximately 15 feet before arresting with her ice axe. Her connection to the fixed line had not been lost, and she sustained no visible injury. But recovering her position and stabilizing enough to resume movement took nearly 10 minutes. At those temperatures, the body cannot recover lost heat. It can only manage the rate at which it continues to lose it. Meg's rate had already been higher than the others before the slide. After it, the gap widened further. While moving toward Meg to assist, the support climber passed Astrid at approximately 27,250 feet. She had stopped to switch oxygen cylinders. Her primary had run out, consistent with 6 to 7 hours of flow since midnight departure. He observed the switch, waited while she confirmed flow, and continued toward Meg. Within minutes, the new cylinder had failed. The regulator valve housing had accumulated moisture from hours of breathing cycle exposure. When the fresh cylinder opened, that moisture froze solid at the valve interface before usable flow could establish. The mechanism locked. Astrid attempted to clear it by removing one glove to feel the interface, but could not identify the obstruction before re-gloving became necessary. At 27,250 feet, the partial pressure of oxygen is roughly 1/3 of sea level. A climber who has been on supplemental flow for hours and whose body has been working at sustained output in extreme cold does not carry a buffer when that flow stops. Deterioration begins within minutes and accelerates. Astrid had enough experience to recognize the onset, the narrowing of peripheral vision, the difficulty sequencing a thought, the lag between the intention to move and the body's execution of it. These were identifiable to her even as they progressed. She attempted to signal the support climber, who was above her with Meg, but the wind and visibility made communication across that distance impossible. The support climber returned to Astrid's position at approximately 8:50 a.m. after stabilizing Meg on the fixed line above. He found Astrid seated against the slope with her mask in place but no oxygen flowing. He checked both the regulator housing and the cylinder connection. The interface was fully frozen and did not yield under glove pressure. He carried no spare regulator assembly. The only remaining option would have been to transfer Astrid to another climber's system. But Meg's oxygen was actively in use, and the other women were out of reach below in near zero visibility. He remained with Astrid and continued attempting to clear the frozen regulator while she was still capable of responding to him. By 9:10 a.m., Astrid's responses had stopped. Her eyes were open, but not tracking. She had slid partially sideways along the slope until the fixed line held her. The support climber attempted several more times to restore the oxygen connection. The mechanism did not move. By 9:20 a.m., Astrid was no longer breathing. He checked for a pulse at the side of her neck. Nothing was detectable. He secured her to the anchor to prevent the body from sliding further and moved back toward Meg's position above. By the time the support climber reached Meg again, her condition had advanced significantly. She was still on the fixed line, but was no longer initiating movement independently. Her movements had taken on the slow, uncoordinated quality consistent with severe hypothermia. She would step when her foot was physically guided toward the slope, but would not then take the following step without the same external prompt. Claire, who had stopped at an anchor section below and been unable to raise the group by radio in the wind noise, had begun ascending back toward the group's last known position along the fixed line. The ascent against 60-mile-per-hour gusts at that altitude required her to stop and brace at every anchor and consumed energy she had been conserving for the lower descent. She reached Meg and the support climber at approximately 9:25 a.m. Claire and the support climber positioned themselves on either side of Meg and attempted to move her downward along the fixed line. She was able to take steps when physically supported on both sides, but could not sustain forward movement without continuous contact from both climbers simultaneously. Every significant gust required all three climbers to brace at the same moment, breaking any rhythm in the descent and placing additional physical demand on Claire and the support climber, both of whom were managing their own heat loss in the same conditions. The three of them were covering ground, but slowly and with enormous effort expended per foot of progress. At approximately 9:30 a.m., Meg sat down on the slope at roughly 27,100 feet. She did not fall. She sat in a way that appeared deliberate, but was consistent with her body reaching the point at which it could no longer sustain upright posture under the combined load of wind, temperature, and advancing hypothermia. Claire and the support climber attempted to bring her upright twice. On the first attempt, they managed to get her mostly standing before her legs gave out against the slope and the gusts. On the second, she made no visible effort to assist. Her arms did not reach for the fixed line. Her legs did not push against the slope. There was no viable shelter option. The terrain provided nothing, and erecting any form of emergency bivvy in sustained 60-mile-per-hour gusts on an open snow slope was not feasible. The support climber made radio contact with base camp at approximately 9:40 a.m. No helicopter could operate at that altitude in those conditions, and any ground-based support was hours below. There was nothing to do but stay with Meg as long as staying remained safe. Meg remained partially conscious during the early portion of the time they stayed with her. She was not responding to verbal direction, but her eyes tracked movement sporadically during the first 15 minutes. She made no attempt to stand or reposition herself on the slope. Claire maintained physical contact with her to prevent any downhill movement. The wind did not reduce. The temperature did not rise. Nothing about the surrounding environment shifted in a direction that would have altered what was already in progress. By 10 a.m., Meg's breathing had become shallow and irregular. The change was visible in the rhythm of her chest and in the reduced condensation forming against the interior of her oxygen mask. Her eyes had stopped tracking. Within minutes of 10 a.m., the breathing stopped. The support climber checked for a pulse at the side of her neck. Nothing was detected. The support climber signaled the need to descend. Both he and Claire had been stationary in the wind and cold for nearly 30 minutes. Remaining longer would not change Meg's outcome, and the risk of additional casualties on that section of slope was real and increasing with every additional minute of static exposure in those conditions. Claire and the support climber began descending from Meg's position at approximately 10:10 a.m. They moved separately along the fixed line, with Claire approximately 30 to 40 feet below the support climber. The visibility remained at near zero. Identifying anchor points required physical contact with the rope, rather than visual confirmation of what lay ahead. The fixed line was the only reliable navigational reference on the slope. Claire had been on the upper mountain for over 10 hours by that point, including the ascent, the turnaround, the time spent stationary at the lower anchor while waiting, and the energy expended ascending back to Meg's position against the full storm. She was still moving and still clipping anchors correctly, but the support climber noted during the first 20 minutes of their shared descent that her movements had acquired a slightly mechanical quality, each step placed with care, but without the instinctive micro-adjustment to terrain that had characterized her earlier movement. At approximately 10:40 a.m., Claire reached an anchor at roughly 26,800 feet, and prepared to transition to the next lower section of fixed rope. The transition between anchors is the single most exposed moment in the descent sequence. The climber must unclip from the upper anchor, locate the lower rope, and re-establish contact before the fixed line can provide any arrest function. In clear conditions with stable footing, the process takes seconds. In near zero visibility with gusts hitting an open ice slope at irregular intervals, those seconds carry a different weight entirely. When the support climber descended to the same anchor shortly after, he found the lower fixed rope hanging free with no one on it. He descended carefully to the next anchor below, repeatedly sweeping the slope ahead with his headlamp through the blowing snow, and then continued further. Approximately 250 feet below the anchor, where Claire had last been clipped, a dark form was visible at the edge of his lamp range against the slope. It had come to rest against a rock formation at approximately 26,600 feet. He reached her position after nearly 20 minutes of careful descent. Claire was unresponsive and had no detectable pulse. Her helmet had sustained significant damage along the right side. The injuries visible on her upper body and head were consistent with a high-speed fall and tumble down hard ice. No resuscitation attempt was made. He confirmed she was deceased, documented her position on his GPS device, and continued the descent toward Camp 4. Laura had been descending alone since the group had separated in the early stages of the storm. She had been below the others on the fixed lines from the moment the turnaround began, lower on the slope and geometrically closer to Camp 4 than any of the 4 women throughout the entire descent. In the hours since the storm hit, she had been making continuous downward progress, slower than her pace in clear conditions, but oriented correctly on the fixed lines and working through each anchor transition without any reported contact with the group above. Members of the first rope group, who had reached Camp 4 at approximately 10 a.m. after their own difficult descent, reported observing a single figure on the fixed line above camp during occasional brief breaks in the blowing snow when looking out from the tent entrance. From that distance and in those conditions, the figure appeared to be moving at intervals and stationary during gusts, which was consistent with correct descent behavior. At approximately 11 a.m., the figure stopped moving entirely at a position estimated to be between 300 and 400 feet above Camp 4. 2 members of the first rope group made an immediate attempt to ascend toward the stationary figure. They exited Camp 4 and made upward progress for approximately 100 feet before sustained gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour made further forward movement impossible without losing their own footing on the fixed line. They retreated to the tent. Radio calls to Lore on the group frequency produced no response. The wind held at full intensity. No further attempt was possible while conditions remained as they were. The support climber reached the section of fixed line where Laura had stopped at around midday. He found her seated against the anchor with her face turned toward the slope, unresponsive to physical contact. He checked for a pulse and found none. Her oxygen mask was in place, but her primary cylinder had fully emptied, and her secondary had not been switched to, indicating she had lost the capacity to manage her own equipment before her reserves ran out. Her death was consistent with hypoxia compounding advanced cold exposure after a prolonged period of solitary descent. He documented her position and completed the final section of descent to Camp 4. All 4 bodies were located and documented before the storm intensified further that afternoon. Astrid remained secured to the fixed line anchor at approximately 27,250 feet. Meg lay on the upper shoulder in the position she had last occupied, while Claire and the support climber stayed with her. Claire had come to rest against a rock formation below the anchor transition point where she had fallen. Laura was found seated against her anchor less than 400 vertical feet above Camp 4. The storm held for approximately 38 hours. When conditions cleared, all 4 positions were visually confirmed from Camp 4 by telephoto lens. Meg's GPS device, satellite communicator, and the support climber's GPS unit, documenting all 4 positions with timestamps, formed the primary framework for reconstructing the events, alongside written accounts from the support climber and all 3 members of the first rope group. The cause of death for each woman was individually determined. Meg Harlow died from hypothermia following prolonged exposure, with the heat loss sustained during and after her slide and the extended stationary period on the open shoulder identified as key contributing factors. Astrid Petra died from acute hypoxia after her secondary oxygen cylinder regulator froze at the point of connection during the cylinder switch. Claire Neve died from fatal trauma, sustained during a fall at an anchor transition point in near zero visibility under sustained high wind conditions. Laura Sundström died from hypoxia and cold exposure after losing the physical and cognitive capacity to switch to her secondary cylinder before her primary reserves were exhausted. No equipment defect, fixed rope failure, or individual procedural error was identified as a contributing factor in any of the 4 cases. The expedition's formal report identified the storm's accelerated arrival as the central factor driving all 4 outcomes. The system moved onto the upper mountain 2 to 3 hours ahead of its last revised forecast, eliminating the descent margin that had existed when the group turned around at 6:45 a.m. The report found no procedural error in the expedition's decisions up to that point. The gear, the acclimatization rotations, the departure timing, and the turnaround response were all consistent with accepted high-altitude practice. The individual failure points were each examined separately, and none were attributed to equipment defect or individual error. They were the cumulative product of 4 climbers being above 26,000 feet when a storm arrived earlier and hit harder than any forecast that morning had indicated it would. None of the 4 women were recovered. The surface conditions on the shoulder and upper Abruzzi spur following the storm were assessed as unsafe for recovery attempts across all 4 positions, and the expedition was in the final stages of its permit window. Meg Harlow, Astrid Petra, Claire Neve, and Laura Sundström remained on the mountain at the elevations where they had been found. The case was formally closed without dispute. All 4 women had entered the same weather window on the same morning under the same forecast. All 4 had prepared correctly, checked their equipment, completed their acclimatization rotations, and turned around the moment the relay came through. Not one of them made it back to Camp 4. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.